Filistin'de yaşananları görüyoruz, biliyoruz ve Siyonist İsrail'i Rabbim Kahhar ismi şerifi hürmetine kahru perişan eylesin. Ve hep birlikte inşallah oradaki yaşananları görerek kendi içimizde bir olalım, iri olalım, diri olalım, kardeş olalım. Rabbim bu birliğimizi daim eylesin.
And you see, one of the problems is the Quran basically says that any lands or territories that were once under Muslim control must be retaken at all cost. That the idea of jihad involves various things, but one of them is waging war, literally war, against anybody who not only blasphemes or mocks Islam, but also who has taken over properties. That essentially what we find is a rich, powerful, successful Jewish nation in the Middle East is intolerable to those who are fundamental believers of Islam. Now, keep in mind that only about 10% of Muslims are what we would call seriously dedicated jihadists. But many, many more do believe in the Quran in a very literal sense. And if they believe it, then they have to honor this command. It's interesting when you begin to see what were the boundaries of the Muslim empire under the Turks, in fact. It includes Spain, much of Portugal, much of countries like Bulgaria and much of the Eastern European countries. The belief is that those countries should again one day be reincorporated into the growing global caliph. And have no mistake about it, when you look at Islam, you have to understand that their objective, their theology teaches them taking over the entire world. And instead of doing it through preaching the message, which they will do, but they also believe it's done by the sword. I'm not making that up, that's their theology. Now, I have some Muslims saying, well, I don't believe that's what the Quran teaches. And I said, well, then you haven't read it, have you? Yet despite the overwhelming numbers of this force that comes against Israel, in fact, Ezekiel said it's like a cloud that will cover the land. The invasion, we're told, will fail miserably. In fact, he says, you shall fall upon the mountains of Israel. And although the destruction that comes is from the hand of God, he says, I will execute judgment. When Israel was made a nation, the UN General Assembly Resolution number 194, read it up, maintained the position that Jerusalem would be forever known as an international city under United Nations supervision. Now, Jordan wasn't willing to allow that to happen, and Israel is not willing to allow that to happen. But somehow it happens when it says that the Antichrist will confirm a covenant with Israel for 7 years. It's my wonder if somehow that becomes part of the agreement. Remove the animosity and the antipathy that exists because Israel controls the holy mountain and controls the religious sites, most important religious sites of the three major world religions. But it's interesting, you may think again it's far-fetched, but Anthony Zaleski, who writes for the Daily Record, wrote a whole article on how this should work out. How do we bring an end to this endless conflict? And listen to what he said. He said, Jerusalem is arguably the most important city in the world. It is certainly the most controversial and the most fought over city in the world, which is kind of interesting because most of its history, Jerusalem is kind of a backwater. It's not on a main route. It's not on a sea coast. And yet it has been attacked 52 times. It has been captured 44 times. It has been besieged some 23 different times. And twice it's been destroyed. But he says political representatives of each of the three religions have fought to get their turns governing Jerusalem. And then he adds, one option is to declare Jerusalem an international city that should be controlled, governed, and policed by the United Nations. That is, in the eyes of the United Nations, the legal status of Jerusalem right now. And part of their argument, when Jerusalem wants to make it their capital, in the back of their heads they're saying, well, that's not right because the UN, which created Israel, is the real one who should be in control of Jerusalem. That fifthly, we find that the beast will rise to world leadership, and I talked at length a couple weeks ago about the United Nations and how that all fits together in my mind. But most importantly, lastly, that the temple in Jerusalem will be rebuilt. And the reason we know that is because Jesus makes reference to it, Paul makes reference to it, that in the end time there is a temple on the Temple Mount in which the beast can place his image and declare himself to be God. In fact, the term that's used for that in Daniel and in Matthew 24 is the abomination that causes things to become desolate. I believe that the Battle of Gog and Magog will be the thing that will initiate really the beginning of this one world government and one world religion, and I can't even begin to outline what the details might be. But you see, this one world religion that will come on the scene will only survive for 3.5 years, according to Revelation, because at the midpoint of the tribulation, following the completion of this temple, which I assume will cover that first 3.5 years, that the beast, it says, sets an image of himself in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Daniel 9:27 says, in the middle, that is speaking of the beast, will put up an end to sacrifice and offering in the temple in Jerusalem. And on a wings of a temple, he will set up an abomination that causes or leads to desolation. And Jesus said in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination, see standing in the holy place, that means the holiest of holies, the most sacred part of the temple sanctuary. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing in the holy place, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. I don't know what that place is, but I would venture to say it's not going to be something quite so obvious. But it's interesting because what happens with that 3.5 years? Well, Zechariah tells us this in Zechariah 12:10. I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication, and they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one who mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn. Is this what Paul meant when he wrote in Romans 11, when the full number of the Gentiles has come in, then all Israel will be saved? So it is that God says in the end he'll save all Israel.